Hey, what's going on everybody? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be replacing throttle actuators on a 2011 BMW M3. So right here on the table in front of me are two throttle actuators. If you don't know what they look like, this is what they look like. If you own one of these cars or you're doing research, of course you know what they look like. But this is a pretty common problem on this generation of M3. Each actuator controls one bank of throttle bodies. Since of course it's a V8, there's two banks of throttle bodies since there's two banks. These actuators sit in the valley of the engine, so they are kind of tricky to get to. But overall, not too bad. Doesn't take that many tools. The other aspect of this is these actuators could fail in a variety of ways. There's both the electronic control failure. These have a circuit board inside of them that could fail, or a mechanical failure, which would be the drive mechanism. There's a series of gears inside. Those gears can disintegrate over time. So there's a bunch of different fault codes that can come up when one of these actuators fails or both of these actuators fail. We'll put that information in the description below. But with that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to get this job done. Some of the tools you're going to need for this job actually is really not that much. I know it looks like a huge one, but some of your basics. You need a T30. I prefer a long T30 like this, but a short one with an extension will work just fine. A T25, an 8mm, 10mm magnetic screwdriver or pocket screwdriver, very useful. An angled pick, one of these trim clip removal pliers, 6mm hose clamp driver, a long 1/4 inch extension, 1/4 inch ratchet. Alternatively, we have this, it's a torque wrench specifically for hose clamps or anything that's a low torque spec. We're going to be torquing those hose clamps when we put it back together. Along with that, optional, I recently got domed on the head, so I now use one of these hood lift support locks to make sure that it won't hit you in the head. That's kind of an important thing. Have this 1/4 inch impact driver just to speed up the process. And of course, at the end, when I put everything back together, I have this Bluetooth scanner from Autel. Just gonna make sure that everything works as intended and there's no fault codes. So we'll show you what that looks like at the end. But with that said, let's go and jump right into it. All right, so kind of what we said at the beginning, the throttle actuators sit underneath all of this. There's a lot of stuff here. We're gonna have to start off by removing the complete intake system, including the intake plenum. So I'm gonna start right up here with the forward air collector. There's two T20 screws that hold this piece in place. Next up, we're going to remove the airbox cover. It's held down with the same T20 screws. And this is where they're located on the airbox cover. Next up, we're going to remove our line here. This is our air feed for the secondary air pump. It's one of these connectors from BMW. You just have to depress this little tab and then pull it off. Should come off fairly easily. Next up, we're going to take a 6mm hose clamp driver and loosen this clamp here at the plenum. And then we can remove our air filter and intake tube in one piece. All right, next up, we're going to remove the air filter housing box. We need to remove this in order to gain access to the clamps that secure the plenum on bank 2, which is the left side of the engine. Two 10mm screws hold this in place. And then once those are removed, just lift straight up and the box will come out in one piece. So we do have a couple of connections here at the front of the plenum. We have our intake air temperature sensor here, and then there is a vacuum line under here. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this. I have this little metal tang right here. You just press that down and the connector will just slide right off. You wanna make note of this connector. We'll be making a lot of electrical connections we have to undo during this job. So just know that this one needs to come up. So in total at this point, we have 10 connections that we're gonna have to undo. From the plenum. There is a vacuum hose in the front here. There is another hose there for the secondary air pump in the back. And we have our 8 clamps that secure the plenum to the top of the throttle bodies. Unfortunately, really difficult to show you that, but I will show you where those clamps are and how you gain access to them once the plenum is off. I think that's gonna be the easiest way to explain it. But you will want one of these flexible hose clamp drivers, and they're 6mm. For demonstration purposes, we're going to show you the cylinders 5 and 6 here on bank 2 because you're not going to be able to see anywhere else. But you can see right here the fuel rail is clearanced, and this is where those clamps are. They have a rubber backing on the little intake boot, so you can press on them and they're not going to move, which is nice. So they're not going to be that tight. Just loosen them up a little bit. And I would say it's kind of self-guiding to a degree-ish. But just look for the head of the clamp, get the hose clamp driver on it, and just unloosen it. BMW actually did a pretty decent job with thinking this one through for once they thought about having to take it apart. And I'm gonna go ahead here and do the same thing on the right cylinder bank. Can't really show you because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the way, but it's the exact same process. Okay, went ahead and undid all the clamps. Just gonna lift the plenum up. So now it's free. So we have this connection here at the front. It's a little vacuum hose. We're gonna go ahead and disconnect that. You can see it right there. So just press those tabs and then it'll slide off this barb. Now our other line is here in the back towards the rear left corner. That is gonna be very difficult to show you, but it's the same style as this, just a little bit larger, and just be patient with it. It will eventually come off. But I find it easiest to lift the plenum a little bit and then try to release it. This hose right here, by the way, is the fresh air hose for the idle control system. But again, you'll just want to press. There's like some knurling on the outside. You just need to depress those, which opens the lock, and then you can go ahead and slide it off. In this case, it kind of came off at an angle, but once it gets past the lock, so you can just pop it right off. And then right here, you could see on the fuel rail how they've given you the space to get to these clamps. And then you can also see the little rubber backing here that prevents the hose clamp from moving out of place. So again, for once, BMW actually thought about the person that has to work on the car. And from here, you can actually see our throttle actuator control arms. There's our left bank, there's our right bank. Bank 1 is on the right side, bank 2 is on the left side. This is cylinders 1 through 4, cylinders 5 through 8. So we're gonna start here in this area undoing our connectors. I'm gonna go ahead and do this one first. And then we'll do our water temperature connector there. You're gonna be tempted to start undoing these connections here, but don't, because we have a nice little bulkhead fitting here that literally deals with all this stuff separately, so you can just leave that alone. We are gonna have to undo our throttle position sensor for bank 2. That is actually directly under here. You can kind of release it at this point, but I'm gonna go ahead and lift this whole thing up at some point, and we'll undo that connection last. Next up, we have our oil pressure sensor here, which is a little bit tricky to get at, but sorry you're not gonna be able to see it on camera, but similar style connector, just depress the little metal lock tab and it'll pull right off. This is the oil pressure sensor or oil pressure switch sensor connector. Just anytime you see a connector with this little metal tab, just press the tab down and that's the lock for it. We have our exhaust Vano solenoid right here for bank 1. Same kind of metal connection, just depress the metal tang and it'll release. And now we have our wiring for our AC compressor clutch. I'm actually gonna start up here and release these plastic holders. Because basically this whole wire, all this needs to come up so we can lift this center section high enough. And lastly, we have our AC compressor clutch connector down here. I'm gonna use this pick to open the lock, and then hopefully I can slide it off at the same time. This one's a little awkward. There we go. Was able to do that all one hand. Vano solenoid connector, AC compressor clutch connector. Now that we've gotten all of our connectors undone up front, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the 4 10mm nuts that secure our electrical housing box, I guess we wanna call it. Again, these are all 10mm. And then there's 2 back here. Now, some of you might be screaming at me right now that I should put like towels or something in the throttle bodies. You can certainly do that. I don't particularly see the need to do that. We're not really gonna be working within that area. And honestly, even if something were to fall in that, you should be checking that before you put anything back together. So there's nothing that's really gonna come from that. If you block them off, you can. I don't particularly find the need to do that in this case. Now, if it were sitting for a long period of time, sure. But for a repair like this, I don't really see the point in doing that. You can go ahead and disagree with me in the comments if you want. I encourage it. So one stud is right there, the other stud's right there. And now that you've loosened all of this, this whole thing moves around nice and freely. That's what we're going for. All right, we're gonna go ahead and undo our throttle actuator connectors here. All you're gonna do is just push down on this lock, and then the connector should slide off relatively easily. Never promise that they're gonna slide off nicely if they've been on there for a while. But actually, you kind of heard the connector make a pop noise once I released it. There we go. So these are our 2 throttle actuator connectors. And then underneath, we have a connector for the Bank 2 throttle position sensor. We're gonna also have to release that. And for that, I'm gonna have to just release it and then show you where the locks are for it. See these right here, there's a lock there, and there's a lock here. Just simply squeeze them and it'll slide right off. And I'm just gonna go ahead and make some room for myself by pulling all of the wiring leads that go to Bank 1 out of the way. And now we have access to our throttle actuators underneath. I'm gonna go ahead and grab a pole jack handle just to kind of hold this up. But now we can go ahead and work on removing the throttle actuators themselves. Okay, next up, we're going to lift this entire electrical wiring housing, whatever you want to call it, up so we can get access to the actuators. I'm gonna go ahead and use this floor jack handle, very sophisticated piece of technology here. I'm just kind of wedging underneath there to hold it up so I don't have to fight it while I'm removing the actuators themselves. And also, yeah, make note, this is our throttle position sensor wiring lead for Bank 2. I'm gonna kind of just leave that off to the side. It's fine where it is. So we have a couple of mechanical connections that we need to consider here. We have our arm that goes from the throttle actuator to the bank of throttle bodies. It's gonna be the same for both Bank 1 and Bank 2. Now, I'm gonna be replacing the arms at the same time as I replace the throttle actuators. So I'm gonna release this arm here from the throttle body drive mechanisms themselves. And then there's gonna be 3 T30 screws that secure the throttle actuator to the engine block. And that's gonna be the same for both throttle actuators. I find that the best tool for releasing these actuator arms is one of these trim panel removal tools. You're just gonna go ahead and slide it down like so, and then just push back and it pops off. Very easy. These are not really held on that tight, so you don't need that much force, but I find that this style tool pushes evenly enough where it just makes it easy for these to pop off. And like I said, we're gonna be replacing these arms at the same time, so I'm just gonna leave them attached to the throttle actuators and pull them out together. So like I said, there's 3 T30 screws that hold the throttle actuators in place. I'm gonna start on Bank 2 just because it's a little bit more accessible and you can actually see it. So I kind of like the long T30 for this. Of course, you gotta get a angle on it. Last thing you wanna do is strip one of these out because you will hate your life. These are not torqued very tight, only 10 Newton meters from the factory. And I'm also going to use a magnetic pickup tool to drag these out of here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get them loose to the point where they're no longer threaded in place. And then we'll actually remove the actuator after that. Now that we remove those 3 T30 screws, I'm gonna go ahead and pull the Bank 2 throttle actuator out. It's, you know, you're gonna have to do a little bit of a rotation and a little bit of a twist and, you know, finagle it, but it will work its way out. There we go. So this is the original throttle actuator from this car. You can see it's dated the July 10th, 2008. This car was early production September 2010. So these are the original throttle actuators. And for point of reference, this car has 44,000 miles. We'll open one of these just to see what they look like on the inside, see if any of the gears are wearing out, because that's usually the common failure. This car had no faults. We're just doing this preventatively, but be interested to see what these look like. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remove the Bank 1 throttle actuator. This is the exact same process. Remove the 3 T30 screws and then just slide it out. And this will be a lot easier now that the other actuator is not there. Also worth mentioning, the bank or the valley of this engine is going to be a very common area for debris to collect or for rodents to nest, so don't be surprised to find a lot of stuff in there. Now is also a great opportunity to clean all that out. So here are the 2 throttle actuators off the car. These are original. Like I said, they were produced in July of 2010. The car was built in September 2010. So I know for a fact these are original. Plus, it's my car. I've had it its entire time, so I know it's been replaced and not replaced. But when I removed the 5 T20 screws that hold the backing plate, and what I found on the inside of both these actuators is that the gears are in fact wearing out. Nothing that we haven't seen before. But most commonly, the mechanical failure of these is always going to be these gears. These are a very common failure item. There are rebuild kits out there. However, I think that's a little bit tricky because if you don't know if the actuator is good electronically or not, rebuilding it mechanically could potentially be a waste of time. Also, there have been updates to these actuators over the years. So what we're installing today is the most up-to-date version. That doesn't mean that it's infallible or can't break at a later date, but all these gears are showing signs of wear. You can see little shards of plastic in here. Another thing that's common is these motors are brushed. Some of that brush material can cause the circuit board to short out. Now that discoloring right there is totally fine. That's not a sign that there's an issue here. But again, if you had something fail on this, you would have to look at the circuit board and see if one of these MOSFETs had failed or any other sign that there's been a problem on this end. And unless you know what you're looking for on that, you're never going to find that. So realistically speaking, if you have a throttle actuator problem, the best course of action more times than not is to replace both of them. Even if only one has failed, if one has failed, the other one's probably not that far behind. So these are 44,000 miles, pretty significant wear on the gears. I would actually imagine these new ones going in, they're going to be a little bit more responsive just because that gap in the teeth is not going to be as wide. So yeah, this is just preventative maintenance when you own these cars. It just is what it is. So we're going to start with our Bank 1 throttle actuator, which is going to be on the right side of the engine bay, left side facing it. We're just going to go ahead and slide it in and line it up with the mounting tabs. Goes without saying that you want to get all 3 of these screws started by hand. And you don't want to tighten any of them down before you have all of them started, because if you're tightening one down, you're going to find that it's probably going to be misaligned and you're not going to be able to actually get it into place. So torque spec is 10 Newton meters for these screws. But you're gonna have a hard time getting a torque wrench in there. So I'm just snugging up with my hand. Honestly, once they're tight, they're tight. You can't really go that hard on these anyway. Perfect. And next up, we're going to attach the throttle actuator arm. These just clip into place. And just squeeze them on. And you want to make sure that you hear that click. If you don't hear the click, they're not secured and you're going to hate your life later. Also, no need to lubricate these, just install dry as is. They're not lubricated from the factory. BMW doesn't specify to do it. And to be honest, I don't really think these are that much of a wear item anyway, but for the slight additional expense, to me it makes sense just to replace them. All right, and next up, we're gonna do throttle actuator for bank number 2. Similar process, just have to kind of squeeze this in here. Now that the other actuator's in place, obviously there's just a little less room to work with, but go ahead and drop it down and line it up with its mounting post holes. These mounting screws are a lot easier to see, so I'm just dropping them in place. And again, we're gonna get these started by hand. And again, you know, 10 Newton meters is the torque spec for these, but you're just gonna have a very difficult time getting a torque wrench in there. So I just go until that they're tight, like that. And then we'll go ahead and install the throttle actuator arm here as well. Just line them up and make sure they snap into place. There we go. Just double checking those connections real quick. Nice, good. Now comes the fun part, plugging everything back in and not missing anything along the way. So my recommendation is to start from the middle here and then work your way out. And also remember, this connection here comes to the underside of this electrical box, so that's pretty easy to miss. And if you don't plug in the throttle position sensor for bank 2 and you start the car, it's gonna be instant limp mode and very unhappy. And the reason for that is the throttle position sensors are in line with the throttle actuator, so the position of the throttle actuator should match the position of the throttle position sensor. They should both be the same reading. If one of those data points is missing, it all automatically goes into limp mode. And I'm going to start off by plugging that throttle position sensor back in and also making sure that the wiring lead is connected to the little housing underneath so it slides into place. If this had fallen off, just make sure that line's back up. You should hear an audible click on most of these connectors. If you don't, for some reason, just make sure that the lock mechanism is closed. If you can see that the lock mechanism is closed, or if you push on it and you feel a click, that's how you know it's seated. I'll plug this back in here. And then we have a connection over here that we need to plug back in as well. And we'll just do a quick double check. We want to make sure that everything is plugged in under here, which it appears to be. And then from there, I want to make sure that these wires here are routed back underneath the fuel rail to the front of the engine. For what it's worth, I have seen some people just kind of leave this stuff plugged in up front and then just force this up from the middle. I don't think you should do that. Anytime you have to pull on wires, that's always a risk. So I find it easier, just, you know, the extra 2 minutes it takes to disconnect everything from the front of the engine. Just do that and don't risk breaking anything. Next up, we have our Vanos solenoid there. Plug that in. So everything now is plugged in this area here. Everything fits the way that it should. Throttle actuators, this connection, our throttle position sensor, here. Okay, everything is connected. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the 4 10mm nuts that secure this electrical housing to the top of the engine. There's 2 up front and 2 in the back. Just go ahead and snug those down. Again, 10 Newton meters if you want to use a torque wrench, but I don't think this is necessary for this. Nice, done. We're going to start here with our oil pressure switch up front. Should just be able to push into place. Heard it click. This right here is for our intake air temperature sensor that's on the plenum, so we're going to leave that for last. And now we're going to work our way down here to the front of the engine. First up is going to be our Vanos solenoid, which the orientation on this connector is a little goofy, so just have to kind of feel it in place. Okay. Well, that was weird. That was a little bit of a struggle. And then we have our AC compressor clutch connector, which comes all the way down here. Also kind of an awkward angle. You have to line it up and then push it in from behind. And the AC lines are a little bit in the way, so it makes it extra challenging. Clicked in place, and now we can go ahead and put the wiring lead back into these little retainers. Just keeps them secured and out of the way. Okay, so now that all the electrical connections have been made, with the exception of the intake air temperature sensor, I'm gonna go ahead and put the car in accessory mode, plug in our Bluetooth scanner, and then look at live data on my phone with the Autel app, make sure that everything is working the way that it's supposed to. It's gonna throw a fault code for the intake air temperature sensor, that's fine, we'll clear that at the end. But just wanna make sure that everything is working mechanically before we put the plenum and everything else back on. Really sucked to put it back together and realize you missed something or there's a problem, so now is the time to check it. If you have access to ISTA, there is a special function to test the actuators, but doing it in accessory mode and looking at the data is going to give you just the same information that you would need as using the ISTA special test. So I went ahead and plugged in the scan tool. I'm just looking at fault codes real quick. Intake air temperature sensor, that's an obvious one, and that's present because it's not plugged in. The other one that popped up that surprised me was coolant temperature sensor. I actually just never pushed the connector all the way down. I now have, and it says not present, so it's already identified that it's now reading data from that. There's no other fault codes stored with the one that I knew was going to be there, so that's perfectly fine from this point. I'm going to go back and look at live data real quick, and I just want to look at throttle valves. So we have our actual throttle valves, and then we have our nominal values. These should basically be pretty close to one another. So I'm gonna go ahead and press the accelerator pedal, and both should basically be at 100%. There's always gonna be a little bit of a lag between them. The refresh on this is not 100%, but those values should both be within close proximity to one another. So now I know that everything is working the way that it's supposed to. We can go ahead and put the plenum back on. Again, there is a special test with ISTA that will do this as well. But if you don't have ISTA, you can also use the scan tool to look at data, make sure everything is functioning the way that it should. And this is a good thing to do before you put it back together, because if you had a problem or you missed a connection, now is the time to figure it out, not put the car back together and figure it out after the fact. All right, so now that we know that everything is good and everything is working as it should, we're gonna go ahead and put our plenum back on. We're gonna go ahead and angle it in from the back to the front. We'll make sure that it drops over these gaskets. I've already pushed the hose clamps back to their intended position, and yeah, go ahead and do it. I'll clear the strut brace in the back. It will pretty much line itself up, which is kind of nice. And before I push this down, we do have this hose in the back for our idle air. I'm gonna make sure that that is seated, because that's the one that's very difficult to reach. That's the hose right there. You wanna make sure that that's properly seated against the bottom of the air plenum. Once that's in place, you go ahead and push the entire plenum down over the throttle body gaskets. And we'll just push the plenum down. You heard it just sort of plop into place. You have one hose under here, remember? Want to push that into position. You'll hear it click. And then we also have our intake air temperature sensor connector. We might as well plug that in while we're here. Here we go. Plenum is in place, and now we can go ahead and tighten down those hose clamps. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and use this torque limiting screwdriver. Torque spec from BMW is 1 Newton meter. It's very easy to over tighten hose clamps, and on these specifically, the last thing you'd ever want to do is cut the gasket or potentially crack the plastic for the plenum. So I'm gonna go ahead and be safe and use this. All right, at this point, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the bottom portion of the air filter housing. Just make sure it lines up with the lower duct. And then also reinstall the 2 10mm screws. Gonna leave those loose for now. Go ahead and tighten those down once everything else is in place. All right, next up, we're gonna drop in our air filter. with the intake tube. Reconnect our secondary air injection pump filter line like so. We'll put our air filter housing cover back on, making sure that everything lines up. The way you'll know it's lined up is the gap on this side will close. This can be a little bit tricky to get to line up sometimes, but it's usually because one of these mounting screws is knocking it out of alignment. And these are T20s. And not worry about making these crazy tight, they shouldn't be anyway. And then we'll take our suction hood right here, that's what it's called by BMW. We'll slide that over this forward section here, line these holes back up, and then you have two T20 screws up front that secure it. And then our last clamp here, which is the BMW calls it the air filter gator to plenum. Their recommendation is 3 Newton meters, which this torque limiting screwdriver does, so we're going to use it. And we're done. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and tighten down the two 10mm screws that hold the air filter housing box to the chassis. All right, and that's how you replace throttle actuators on an E90, E92, or E93 M3, model years 2008 to 2013, or just the S65 B40 engine in general. We've seen these engines swapped into some other cars now, so it's gonna be a similar process. Like I said at the beginning, it looks a lot more intimidating than it really is. It's very few tools. It's really just more of a matter of knowing how to gain access to those clamps that hold the plenum in place, and then some of the tricks in terms of gaining access to those throttle actuators. But you know, once you're in there, it's very easy to get them out, very easy to replace them, very easy to test them even without ISTA, you know, which we did, and we could see that everything was good. You know, putting everything back together is honestly the easy part once you have all the main work done. So we hope you learned a lot in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit that like button. Also hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. As always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.